In the year zero, the goddesses Carvalia, Savadine, and Alashar disappeared from the world. Lost? Abandoned? Forgotten? That depends on who you asked. For the dwarven king Stonejaw, it was a matter of infection. His people, the Bane, were a tribe of proud dwarves touched by Carvalia herself, granting them divine abilities and mocking them with glowing red eyes. And under his rule, they practice a balance between a belief in a goddess and the power within their dwarven blood. Before battles, warriors would pray to Carvalia to watch over them and grant them strength, but these prayers were just half-hearted words, said only in case they should fall in combat. But in Stonejaw's eyes, the Trinity was weakened by the time Savadine spent playing with cats and Alashar's emphasis on thought before action. And this weakening could have been why the gods are nowhere to be found. The detrimental relationship was the reason Stonejaw couldn't allow himself or his people to fully commit themselves to Carvalia. How could they praise a goddess who willingly allowed herself to be put at risk? But of course, there were some who held Carvalia's mantle high. A devout group that praised her for the accomplishments of the dwarves, citing her transference of strength into their people was a crux which upon their kingdom was able to flourish. The most faithful of these Bane was Stonejaw's youngest son, a dwarf who would come to be known only as Ironside. His faith in Carvalia was strong, as seen by the pendant of her likeness which dangled from his neck at all times, and the symbol of her followers emblazoned on his chestplate. It was from this belief that Ironside drew his sense of duty, his wisdom, and his strong sense of mercy. As it has been told through their living mouthpiece, Ilundra, who too was now missing from the world, the goddess that preached a message of unity and compassion among the tribe. For the greater good, they must work together without prejudice. The greater good, however, was something that Grimtoe, the eldest son of Stonejaw, spat at. Mercy and compassion were crutches on which those lacking the stones to take what was theirs supported themselves. And the goddess Carvalia was the blight of the dwarven spirit. Grimtoe saw how the goddess had tamed his brethren, taking the teeth from once great warriors. The dwarves had seen the beasts on the horizon, the cliff sides of the northern reaches, and conquered them, bending nature to their every will. They had torn out their insides and used them to build their kingdom onto the mountain's face, so that for miles all could see what the dwarves were capable of. And the strengths with which these feats were accomplished came from the thickness of their dwarven blood and hide, not from some floozy in the sky. Carvalia turned strong men lame, and Grimtoe made sure they knew it. With the loss of Carvalia, Stonejaw had taken offense. The Shroud and Revenant's goddesses had clearly put her in harm's way, and he saw this as his way to unite the people. But in his own way. Under his command, the Bane set out to take the southern lands. Stonejaw saw his expansion as the only way to protect not only his own people, but the Shroud and the Revenant as well. They had to be protected from their own weakness. Of course, they were met with opposition, but when Stonejaw eventually breached and occupied their towns, he was just and fair. Like he'd been in the battle that had led them there. Just because they were warring, there were still rules to follow, and his opposition were still the people of his world. They were just confused and couldn't see the forest through the trees. In hopes to help his father in breaching the Shroud's defenses, Grimtoe and a small band of Bane made their way into the Shroud's fortifications under cover of darkness, and were able to kidnap their chieftain. Once back behind Bane walls, Grimtoe and his followers tortured the Tabaxi, shaving his mane and forcibly declawing the proud leader, beating him within an inch of his life. Grimtoe left his broken body outside the city walls with a letter tied around his neck that read, If we could do this to your chieftain, what could we do to each of you? When Stonejaw heard of the unauthorized attack and mistreatment of the Tabaxi ruler, he ordered Grimtoe to be detained and pulled to the public square. Once there, Stonejaw had him held down while he pried the fingernails from his son's hands and shaved him of his beard, both of which he pouched and sent with a courier to the Tabaxi walls, in hopes to quell the storms his son has started. Worse yet, he stripped Grimtoe of every arm ring he wore, which marked his status among the tribe, effectively removing him from his royal status. The courier never returned, and Stonejaw expected the worst, his disappointment in his son growing every passing day. A few months later, the guards woke to Stonejaw's bloody body, littered with puncture wounds. Someone had come and struck in the night. Convinced it was the retribution attack by the Shroud and fueled by his uncontrollable rage, Grimtoe and his men geared up, planning to march to the Tabaxi city. However, they were headed off by Ironside and his men, who told him that his attack was unauthorized and this was not the way to handle this. Grimtoe's rogue actions had already caused the death of a courier and now their father. The Shroud and the Bane were now even, and no further actions against the Tabaxi would be taken. With his blood pumping, Grimtoe guffawed at his brother's arrogance. How dare he assume he was to be the successor? That seat belonged to the eldest son. However, Ironside reminded him that he'd been stripped of his position, with the removal of his arm rings, and as such, was no longer eligible to rule. After a heated debate resulting in the onlooking dwarves agreeing with such a ruling, Grimtoe challenged his brother to one-on-one combat. A challenge no respectable dwarf could turn down, especially not to the new ruler. The brothers engaged in combat, fighting tooth and nail, trading blow for blow. The fight lasted for what seemed to be hours, with neither combatant showing sign of slowing. Long after the sun had passed the apex of the sky, both brothers were covered in a sludge of blood, sweat, and mud. Late into the fight, Ironside's foot slipped on the loosened dirt, and that was the opening Grimtoe had been looking for. Over his many years of practicing in one-on-one fights, Grimtoe had developed a sort of finishing move in which he used the end of his spiked boot to puncture the lungs of the challenger. It had become a thing of fable among the tribe, but for as much as he'd used it, his younger brother had taken note. What Grimtoe didn't know was that Ironside had fashioned a side plate of adamantine, which he was wearing under his dressings. Grimtoe's boot met the metal plate with an ear-piercing clang, and a wave of silence washed over the crowd. As a broken spike skidded off the side, Grimtoe stumbled back, falling onto the ground. Ironside quickly jumped up and placed his axe blade to his brother's neck, commanding him to yield. He would not kill his own brother, he proclaimed. He'd proven to the tribe that he'd won, but in the coming days they would need each and every warrior to fight. The goddesses had preached of a unity of all the clans, and Ironside said it needed to start from within the Bane. He pulled his brother to his feet, and once up, Grimtoe immediately pushed him away. He yelled out to the onlookers that if they followed this man, a man who couldn't finish an opponent when it was necessary, a man who still suckled at the tit of his whore god's mercy, then they were all damned to the same fate of their fallen king. Taking his leave, Grimtoe and his followers turned and made their way back to the mountains, where they'd faced any oncoming forces with a stiff middle finger. The tribe now divided, the newly named Ironside abandoned his father's crusade and pulled his followers deep into a network of underground tunnels, where they'd hide and hope the Shroud's lust from revenge had been sated.